Welcome everyone to a brand new episode of the Metal Matt Podcast. As always, I am your host, Metal Matt, and today on this particular episode, which will be the first episode of 2016, first ever Metal Matt Podcast episode of 2016, and we're going to be starting off 2016 with a bang, because the artist that we're going to look at today on the show is probably, undoubtedly, one of the greatest musical artists of our time. And we're going to be looking at the one, the only, Ziggy Stardust himself, the Thin White Duke himself, David Bowie. That's right, it's going to be a David Bowie retrospective. And I've been wanting to do this for quite a while. I've always been interested in David Bowie. I've always liked his music, and I've always wanted to do it for a long time, but I was never really able to do it until now. And with the release of his new album, Black Star, which was just released today, I thought it would be the perfect time to take a look at his entire discography. And man, what a journey it's going to be, man. It really is going to be a journey, because David Bowie is just reinventing himself time and time again. And really, when you think about it, all of his albums do not sound exactly alike. All of them are pretty different from each other. So, with that in mind, we're going to be doing that in just a few moments. But first of all, let's do some quick shout-outs first. First of all, Chucky's Playground, great place to be. If you haven't signed up yet, definitely do it. It's just a great place, awesome place to be. Just awesome just to hang out somewhere, just talk about all kinds of things. So definitely check it out. And Movie Mayhem with Spanky and G, that's a very entertaining podcast done by my friend Spanky and G. If you haven't checked it out, definitely do so. It's just an entertaining podcast to talk about all kinds of movies, so definitely check it out. And so now we move on to David Bowie. And, really, what can you say about David Bowie? First of all, everything's pretty much been said. Like, he's pretty much a legend in music, one of the most popular artists ever. And the first time I really heard of David Bowie he was referenced in a Simpsons episode, and it was actually one of the first Simpsons episodes I ever saw, and it was She of Little Faith, which was aired in around, I want to say, December 2001, I want to say. I'm not 100% sure of the actual air date, but I want to say it was December 2001, around that time period. And there's like some kind of joke, like the church ends up getting destroyed by Homer and Bart unintentionally when they launch a rocket into it. They destroy the entire church, and everybody's trying to come up with a solution on how to fix it. And Marge suggests, let's just write to David Bowie again. And Reverend Lovejoy, no, he's done enough for this church. And I don't know why, but I found that funny. I don't know if that's like a reference to something or what. I don't know, but I just thought it was kind of funny. And then the first song I ever heard about out of him, it was Ziggy Stardust. It was the song Ziggy Stardust, and it was on Guitar Hero, the first Guitar Hero. And I really liked that. Even though it was a cover version, I still really liked it. And so I seeked out, all these David Bowie albums. And Ziggy Stardust, the album, was the first album by him I heard. And from that point on, I was hooked. So that's pretty much how I was introduced to David Bowie. And so I guess we can go ahead and start with the retrospective. And we're going to take a look at his very first album, simply titled David Bowie. And this came out in 1967. And it's pretty different from the stuff that he would do later on. And, you could probably say that about every David Bowie album. But this one in particular it's kind of weird. It's definitely a 60s album, without a doubt. The cover of it is very 60s. The songs are pretty 60s as well. I'm really not sure how to describe it, honestly. I really don't know. Oh man, it's kind of normal, really, when you get down to it. It was sort of like the pop music that was popular at the time. I wouldn't necessarily call it psychedelic, though there are hints of it in it. But it was just like the pop music that was popular at the time. And, stuff like Sell Me a Coat, which I think is very Beatles-esque. It really reminds me of something off, say, A Hard Day's Night, or Help, or something like that. And there's just a lot of stuff like that. And the lyrics here are sort of David Bowie-esque. Some of them are just interesting or flat out creepy. but and then the very last song is very strange. It's very different from the rest of the album, and it's a song called "Please, Mr. Gravedigger." And it's, in some ways, there's not even music to it, really. It's just like sound effects of rain and digging and Bowie just singing. It's just a weird song to end on. And I guess it could be sort of a hint as to what he would end up becoming. But I don't know, it's just a really strange track, and it's probably my favorite track out of all the album, mainly because it is so odd and just jarring, especially when compared to the rest of the album. So overall, this album, it's okay, I guess. I mean, it's not really my kind of music necessarily, and it's probably the most normal David Bowie has ever been in his music career. And it's a bit of an odd start to his career, but if you're really curious as to how David Bowie started out, or if you're a fan of 60s pop, then go ahead and check this out. But if you're a fan of Bowie in his prime, like the rock stuff and stuff like that, you could probably skip this, because really you're really not missing anything. This is really more for like the hardcore Bowie fans who sort of are curious about how he started out. And so then we move on to David Bowie, I guess. There was another album named David Bowie, and this came out in 1969. And what was strange about this one, it was that this particular album had quite a few album names. It was originally released as David Bowie in the United Kingdom. Then when it was released over here in America, it was released as Man of Words and Man of Music. And later on in 1972, it was re-released here in America as Space Oddity, and the cover was a picture of Bowie in a Ziggy Stardust persona. And it was sort of trying to like capitalize on its newfound success. So it is sort of strange, it has a million titles basically. But for simplicity's sake, we're just going to call it Space Oddity. That's the one that I refer to it as the most. And this one, it's a little bit different from what it would end up becoming. It's a lot. I would say it's better than the first album. It's still showing him kind of transitioning. It's still showing him really kind of growing into the songwriter and artist that he would end up becoming. But he's not quite there just yet. He's getting there, but he's not there just yet. This album it's a bit more rock oriented. It's more folk rockish, kind of Bob Dylan-esque, kind of. It's more psychedelic. Obviously, Space Oddity, very psychedelic, and probably his first big hit, I would say. And Space Oddity actually does kind of have a personal feeling to me. Mainly because, and I've talked about this I think I might have talked about this before, I don't know. But I once took a speech class in 2010, and I did talk about this class before in the Marilyn Manson retrospective a couple years ago. And I was talking, and we did the speech class. We took the speech class in which we had to give speeches in front of the class. And I think all of us had to pick a song. And we had to recite the lyrics in sort of like a dramatic fashion. And I decided to go with Space Oddity because I thought that it would be like the best, you know, perfect song, because it does have like a story. It does center around a character, and I thought it would be really cool to kind of, sort of like do it as like a dramatic reading. And it really did go over well with the class, I must say. So I'm always going to like that song because of that. But yeah, Space Oddity is really cool. A very spacey song, obviously, but I really like it. This also has some of his longer songs, actually, like Side Committee. I guess that's how you say it, Side Committee. For a while, that was his longest song because it clocked in at 9 minutes and 35 seconds. And when I was listening to it, I was fine, and I like longer songs. I do. I can listen to some Dream Theater. You know what I mean? And I do like sort of like the longer, more progressive rock songs, and it's sort of what this is a little bit. It has hints of that kind of genre in here, but I do think it does sort of overstay its welcome just a little bit. But I do think it's still a pretty cool song, and Janine is also really good as well. God Knows I'm Good, Memory of a Free Festival, which is pretty cool. Sometimes it does kind of go on a little bit too long, but I like it fine. So overall, Space Oddity, the album, again, much like the first one, it's decent. I would say it's a little bit better than the first one, but Bowie's still working towards who he would end up becoming. And the journey would really end up starting on the next album. And that next album would be The Man Who Sold the World. And this one, is really where Bowie's career ends up beginning. Because for the first time, he really has the Spiders from Mars, which was his backing band for the early 70s. And I think that's really important. Specifically, Mick Ronson on guitar. This was the first Bowie album to feature him on guitar. That's a really important one. Because this is really the first album, the first Bowie album, in which electric guitar is very prominent. It was there sometimes on the Space Oddity album, but here it is just full force, and it's in front of your face, man. And really the first song, it really does show you just how this album is going to be, and it's The Width of a Circle, and it's probably the best song on the album, really. And it's 8 minutes, which you would think might be a little bit long, but honestly, it just kind of flew by to me. And really, the whole album is like that, really. Though this is the longest song on the album, but it's still really good. It is just a hard rock album, without a doubt, I mean, just the guitar is just awesome in this one. Mick Ronson, I would say probably one of the most underrated guitarists of all time. You don't really hear too much about Mick Ronson and his contributions to Bowie's albums in the 70s, but I think it's really important because it really did shape Bowie's sound for a while, especially this glam rock era. And I guess you could argue that this is when the whole glam rock era begun for him. But he was still working towards it. It would be a while before he truly became the David Bowie we all know and love. But as is, this is a really good album, and I was sort of surprised at how good it was. But it's just a really good one, especially if you're like a young guitarist learning how to play. This is a really good one to kind of listen to and sort of learn how to play guitar, because there's some great guitar work by Mick Ronson on here. So, yeah, this really is where the journey pretty much begins for David Bowie. And so now we go on to Hunky Dory, and this was released in 1971. And I would probably say that this was probably his best album to date at the time, honestly, because it's pretty cool, and it probably has some of his most well-known songs on here. Changes is on here, Life on Mars, Andy Warhol is pretty cool as well. Song for Bob Dylan is cool. And it sort of goes back to that kind of folk rock kind of sound, but at the same time, it also kind of mixes with that hard rock sound that he was doing on The Man Who Sold the World. I mean, there's really not too much to say about it, honestly. It's just a really good album, sort of mixing the folk rock kind of sound with that he did on Space Oddity album, and the hard rock sound that he did on The Man Who Sold the World. And those two sort of get combined together, and they make a really good album. So yeah, I definitely recommend it. It's a pretty good album. And so now we get to the real show. And this is going to be pretty interesting. The rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. And this album pretty much made David Bowie. And it's probably his most popular album, I guess. I don't know, Let's Dance would probably be his most popular album. Even then, I think Let's Dance sold the most, but for me, I think this is probably his most popular album. And probably, objectively speaking, it's probably his best album, technically. I would say this is probably one of the first instances of a concept album, I guess. There were those that sort of came before, like The Who with Tommy and with Quadrophenia. Though I think Quadrophenia came around 73, I think. So that was after this one. But I would say this was probably one of the first concept albums after the Tommy by The Who. And this one is pretty much a simple story, really. The story of the album pretty much revolves around this alien named Ziggy Stardust who falls, the man who falls to Earth, pretty much, really. And the story, honestly, the story isn't really very clear on the album itself. Bowie did like these interviews in which he elaborated a bit more on the story. And basically what it is that he's pretty much becomes a rock star. And I think he's trying to warn everybody of an impending apocalypse. And he becomes like this huge rock star. And then he ends up dying on stage at the very end of the album. Spoiler alert. But, I think this album is pretty good, I mean, it pretty much has some of Bowie's best, I think, which is Starman, of course, and Suffragette City, and Ziggy Stardust, the song, which is really good, and it actually it's really interesting because it really shines a light on the band, the Spiders from Mars, who are Ziggy's backup band, and they sort of become jealous of Ziggy because he's getting all of this attention. He's pretty much the face of the band, really, and I'm trying to think of the lyrics. I don't know if these are right or not, but da na 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 na, or should we break his sweet hands? I think that's how it goes. If I recited it wrong, sorry, but yeah, but that's pretty much how it goes. They really do become sort of jealous and envious of all the attention and all the stardom that Ziggy is getting. And it's a pretty interesting song. And Ziggy Stardust probably his most well-known persona by David Bowie's. And just this one, probably one of the best concept albums ever in 5 years. And this is something I forgot to mention with The Man Who Sold the World. And from that point on, with The Man Who Sold the World on to really most of David Bowie's songs, David Bowie really has this talent of the first songs on his albums, the opening songs, probably being some of the best he's ever done. Because the album openers are almost always great. 5 Years really introduces us to the album. Moon Age Daydream is really cool as well. It Ain't Easy, Lady Stardust. I mean, just all kinds of classic songs here. So, yeah, the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars really, it really is just so good. It's probably one of the best concept albums, you could probably ever do, really. It's probably the best, objectively, honestly. So yeah, I would say it's pretty good. And it really does sort of officially, I guess, begin what I like to call the Ziggy Stardust era, where Bowie pretty much dyes his hair red and becomes this whole entire persona. So yeah, it's really good. Probably one of the best concept albums of all time. And then we come to Aladdin Sane, which was released in 1973. And this one, I have to say, this one, without a doubt, is my all-time favorite David Bowie album. I absolutely love this album. This is just great. It pretty much picks up where Ziggy Stardust left off, and even though it's not really a concept album per se, it's still really good. It's just really awesome. I mean, just a lot of great songs. Again, the album opener, Watch That Man, is really good as well. Again, the guitar work. I cannot stress enough how awesome the guitar work is on these albums. Mick Ronson's sort of the unsung hero of David Bowie's backing band. Like I said, underrated as hell. And his guitar work, specifically on this album, awesome. Pretty much every song has just great guitar licks, one after another. And Panic in Detroit, Cracked Actor, sort of like these kind of bluesy-esque kind of guitar riffs, but just so awesome. And Bowie also does a cover of Let's Spend the Night Together, which was originally by the Rolling Stones. And I'll be honest, I actually like this cover a lot better than the Rolling Stones original. I think it really does expand on it. And just the intro is so cool, with this little spacey intro and stuff like that. And the Jean Genie, probably one of my favorite David Bowie songs. I really like that song. It's honestly sort of Doors-esque when you get down to it, It's sort of like Roadhouse Blues a little bit, I think. But, yeah. So, and Lady Gren's Soul, which is the finale to the album closer, which is really awesome, a really great ballad to close things off, to close off an amazing album. So yeah, that's Aladdin Sane, my favorite David Bowie album, without a doubt. If you haven't listened to it, definitely check it out. It is just a fantastic Bowie album. I think it's the best Bowie album, personally. And so now we move on to Pinups, which was also in 1973. And I'll be honest, this was one of those David Bowie albums that I didn't really know existed before this. I thought I knew all the David Bowie albums, but apparently this one sort of flew over my head just a little bit. And this one was a covers album, and like I've said many times in the past, this one is usually either hit or miss. And unfortunately, this one is a bit of a miss. And I don't know, it's not horrible by any means. It's just not very interesting. All the covers are pretty much sort of forgettable. Like Rosalind is okay. It's an okay opener. Here Comes the Night is fine. See Emily Play was sort of disappointing because I really like Pink Floyd's original, but I think that it really works as a psychedelic rock song. But when it's changed to be a glam rock song, I don't know, it just doesn't really fit that well. I mean, I commend Bowie for actually at least trying to make it his own, but I don't think it really worked that well. I mean, I think a lot of the songs on here sort of work the same way, kind of. I don't know. I don't know. It doesn't work for me, personally. So, Pinups is a bit of a minor miss. Honestly, I'd probably skip this one. But, it's a pretty obscure album, I'd say. Because I never knew about it, so... Yeah, but I'm not really a fan of the album. And then we get Diamond Dogs in 1974. And unfortunately, this would be the final David Bowie album under the Ziggy Stardust persona. It would be the final glam rock album he did. He's going to change up his style after this one. So this would be the final one. But the Ziggy Stardust pretty much left on a high note. Because this one is pretty good. And this one, much like Ziggy Stardust, it's a bit of a loose concept album. Originally, the idea it was going to be sort of like Bowie's interpretation of 1984, which is a novel by George Orwell. But unfortunately, Bowie couldn't get the rights to 1984 from Orwell's widow, so he was just sort of forced to kind of do like a generic post-apocalyptic world, which I think works fine, honestly. I really don't mind it too much. And in fact, in a way, I sort of like to think that this one is a bit of a sequel slash spin-off of the Ziggy Stardust album. Because, the story goes that Ziggy was trying to warn everybody of the apocalypse. And I like to think that takes place a little bit after that in this post-apocalyptic world. And so that's what I like to think. And there's even a song called 1984 on here, which is really cool. And Rebel Rebel, which is definitely one of his best songs, by far one of my favorite songs by him. So overall, this was a pretty good album to sort of leave the glam rock era on. I mean, it does sort of suck in the sense that, we're never going to see Ziggy Stardust again after this one. The glam rock thing is sort of done at this point. But, he made some great albums during that time, and we'll always have those. But Diamond Dogs was a pretty good one to leave on. And so now we get to Young Americans, which was released in 1975. And this marked a dramatic change in style and persona. Like I said before, Diamond Dogs was the last one to feature Ziggy Stardust and the last one to feature the glam rock era. And so thus began a new era, which was a soul album. It was a soul album, and which was a little bit odd to me. It does kind of sound weird. I mean, some of it does, but I think it does sort of work a little bit. And this is sort of the album where Bowie enters his new persona, the Thin White Duke. This was near the end of the album era, at least. He didn't really truly introduce until the next album, Station to Station. But here he sort of begins the transition to the Thin White Duke. But this one, which is the soul music album, and I do think this works fine in some ways. I do. It's not a perfect album, honestly. I think it's a pretty solid album. And I know that it really alienated a lot of his fan base, mainly because it was doing something so radically different from anything that he had done before, and that it was a little jarring to everyone. But I think you sort of have to be in the right state of mind. I mean, if you're a fan of soul music, you'll like this fine. Young Americans, it's okay. Fascination is pretty solid. His cover of Across the Universe, man, I don't know. I like the Beatles one a little bit better. And Fame, of course, is pretty good as well. Probably the best song on the album. And some trivia notes. Fame was actually co-written by John Lennon. And he also did backing vocals on it. So that's a pretty cool, interesting little bit of trivia there. So overall, Young Americans, even though Bowie pretty much took a big risk with it, I think it sort of paid off in a way. Because while it is very different from the things they did before, I do think it works fine. It's not the best Bowie album by any means, but if you like soul music, you like this fine. And so now we get to Station to Station. And this was released in 1976, and this was sort of an odd time in Bowie's career. This was sort of a dark time, really, because Bowie was so strung out on cocaine, and this was at the lowest point of his addiction. And as a result, the album, honestly, it's sort of all over the place, in a way. It's sort of cluttered, And this was really a transition album. This was right before the Berlin trilogy. So it was sort of an introduction to that in some ways. And as far as the album goes, I think it's okay. There's actually not a lot of songs on it. There's really only 6 songs on it. But they're all, for the most part, they're all long songs, really. Like the shortest song on here is Golden Years, and that clocks in at 4 minutes. And the longest song on here is Station to Station, the title track, which, if I'm correct, I think it's Bowie's longest song he's ever done, and that clocks in at 10 minutes and 14 seconds. And it is sort of a problem with this album. There are a lot of long songs on here, and they don't really flow well. For the most part, they work fine, but sometimes, especially on stuff like Station to Station, it does sort of overstay their welcome, just a little bit, like those on Space Side of the album. It does sort of go on a bit longer than it needs to. So overall, Station to Station, it's pretty solid, honestly. Bowie was pretty much coked out of his mind when he was doing it, and as a result, sort of all over the place. But I think if you can get past that, it's solid. It's okay. And so then we move on to the first installment of the Berlin trilogy, and that is Low. And this is a really cool album. I thought this was the first installment of the Berlin trilogy, and the reason it was like that, the reason it was called that is because most of it was recorded in Berlin, Germany. And it's really cool. And he was working together with Brian Eno on these. So, and this is just a really good album. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's the best one in the Berlin trilogy. And one interesting thing about this is that I believe for the first time in his career, in his musical career, this was one where he did instrumentals. And I don't think he ever did that before. And that's what's sort of strange about this, is that most of the album are instrumentals, which is sort of odd. Even the album opener is an instrumental, but I really like that because it's pretty much an introduction. It really does set the tone for what's about to come, and it's really cool instrumentals. And Be My Wife is really good. Always Crushing the Same Car is really cool, and that's about making the same mistake over and over again. And I think some of us can really sort of sympathize. I think some of us can really sort of relate, empathize with that kind of stuff, I tend to do that myself from time to time, just a little bit. And Warzala is really cool. A really great instrumental, or mostly instrumental anyway. And it's just like this. It's just a dark, underlying tone to it all. A little bit sinister when you get down to it, but it's just a really cool piece of music. And Art Decade and Subterraneans is really cool. So I would probably say this is one of my favorite Bowie albums. It's probably up there. Maybe top 3 easily. And just a really cool album. If you haven't listened to it, definitely check it out. Personally, I think it's the best one in the Berlin trilogy. And so then we move on to Heroes, which was also released in 1977. And this is the second one in the Berlin trilogy. And, it's pretty much... It pretty much picks up where Low left off, honestly. In some ways, it's a bit similar to Low, but in other senses, it's sort of different. It has a lot of cool songs to it. I think, the album opener, Beauty and the Beast, as always, with Bowie, his album openers are awesome, and Beauty and the Beast is really cool. Joe the Lion is really cool. The Hero song is cool as well. Obviously, one of his most famous ones. And it's just a classic story. 2 lovers meet at the Berlin Wall. And that's really cool as well. Again, much like Low, the second half of the album features a lot of instrumentals. And I think they work well. So, yeah, overall, this one is pretty good as well. I wouldn't necessarily say it's my favorite one. of the Berlin trilogy, but it's still really good, so definitely check it out if you haven't. And so now we move on to Lodger, and, this one sort of does get the, sort of, the weak, it's often been called like the weak link of the Berlin trilogy. And I'm going to have to agree with that, because, I don't know, it's not a horrible album by any means, but at the same time, there's not really much interesting here. Like, there are a few interesting tracks on here, like African Night Flight is pretty cool, The Assassin is really cool, DJ. So yeah, there are some cool tracks on here, but for the most part, it is definitely the weakest album in the Berlin trilogy. I know a lot of people really call it underrated. I don't know if I go that far, though I can understand why people do, because this album does have its moments of brilliance. So, I do kind of like the album, but it's definitely not my favorite of the Berlin trilogy. And so then we move on to Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. And this was released in 1980. And this was, now it was really the first to follow the Berlin trilogy. And, how can you top that, really? And this one, the style here is a bit new wave, a bit post-punk. And it's okay. Again, much like Lodger, I know a lot of people call this one underrated. Again, I wouldn't really go that far. It's okay, but much like Lodger, there's not really too much interesting about it. I will say that there is some good guitar work on here, and that's something I actually forgot to mention. Mick Ronson left around the time of Pinups and Diamond Dogs, so he's not there for the rest of his career, but I do think there is some good guitar work on here, specifically on the song Fashion. And It's No Game, with both parts. There's two parts to It's No Game, which are both the album opener and the album closer. And Ashes to Ashes is pretty cool. Probably one of his best songs, actually, and one of the few shining moments on the album, I think. It ends up revisiting Space Oddity, and it references Major Tom, which is pretty cool. So overall, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps, I don't know, it's probably not his best album, but not necessarily his worst either, So then we go to Let's Dance. Put on your red shoes and dance. And this came out in 1983. And really, when you think about it, this album is such a sellout. It is such a sellout album when you really think about it. But at the same time, it's actually really good. Well, I don't know if I'd say good. I would say it's solid. It is solid. I would say it's an improvement over the past couple of albums, mainly due to the hit singles. And this one is definitely more pop. It's sort of danceable kind of rock, but it's definitely pop. Very commercial when you think about it. Some of his hits, which were major hits, like Modern Love and China Girl, and the title track is really good. And I think Ricochet is really good as well. And I will say, the title track on here is actually 7 minutes and 37 seconds. And, I have to disagree with that a little bit. I don't think it really needed to be that long, in all honesty. The singles version is like 4 minutes, I think, and that's really where it should be. That's how long it should be. If it was like a club remix or some kind of dance remix, then fine. But the album version, it really doesn't need to be 7 minutes long. But like I said, Ricochet is a pretty good album cut. But other than those four, there's not too much to the album. The rest of it really is sort of just filler. So that's why I say it's a bit of a solid album. And I know that I think it's actually his best-selling album of all time. I believe it sold over 7 million copies. So it's definitely his most popular album, technically. It's a solid album. It's definitely not bad. It's pretty good, I would say. But it does sort of begin the decline of Bowie in the 80s. And so now we move on to Tonight, which is in 1984. And yeah, this is sort of the start of the decline of David Bowie. Because, and Bowie pretty much calls the 80s his Phil Collins year. And yeah, it really is sort of, yeah, he is kind of right about that, because especially this particular album, Tonight, because the sound of this album really is like Phil Collins era Genesis, or Phil Collins solo years. Like, it really does sound a lot like that. But with that said, I do think that there are some good moments here. Like, I think Love and the Alien is pretty good as well, even though it does kind of go on a bit too long. There's also a lot of cover songs on here. He covers the Beach Boys' God Only Knows. And he covers I Keep Forgetting. He also does a couple of Iggy Pop songs. Even though he technically co-wrote those. I think he even produced the original albums they were on, because he and Iggy Pop are like close friends and stuff like that. So he produced a lot of the Stooges albums. Like, he produced Raw Power. And he also produced Lust for Life by Iggy Pop. So yeah, this is definitely way poppy, you know what I mean? It's just really commercial, it's just not very good for the most part. It has its moments, like I said, Love and the Alien is cool. And Neighborhood Threat has its moments. But other than that, not very good, And then we move on to Never Let Me Down, which is from 1987. And I'll just go ahead and say it. It's probably his worst album. And I think Bowie himself has even said that. I think he's even said that, yeah, it is pretty terrible. And yeah, there's not really a song on here that I like, honestly. Like, it was supposed to be his return to rock, but it didn't really quite work out that way, honestly. I don't know. Like, there's not really any songs on here that I like, really. I mean, there's really not much to say about it, really. Just kind of forgettable, really. I mean, it's not horrible, I guess. It's not very good, but I wouldn't say it's horrible, It's decent pop music, I guess, but it's probably my least favorite Bowie album. So not much to say, but yeah, it's definitely a major miss. And so then we move on to Black Tie, White Noise. And this was released in 1993. And Bowie ended up forming sort of a side project called Tin Machine. And it was just sort of kind of trying to... He was just trying to kind of recapture his artistic vision, with that band. And I've never really heard Tin Machine, but I might have to check him out, for the sole fact that it is Bowie on there. But yeah, Black Tie, White Noise, I do think this is pretty forgettable. This is probably one of his more forgettable albums. It's not really bad like Never Let Me Down was, but at the same time, it is just sort of like forgettable and bland and stuff like that. It actually does reunite Mick Ronson and David Bowie, which is pretty cool. Because Mick Ronson plays on the song I Feel Free. And it's a pretty cool song, but unfortunately Mick Ronson would end up passing away later that year. So unfortunately there wouldn't be any more reunions between the two, which sucks. Mick Ronson underrated, but yeah, and The Wedding, The Wedding is an instrumental song. It's the intro to the album. It pretty much sets the tone for the entire album. But other than that, and there's also the Wedding song, which closes the album. But other than that, it's mostly forgettable. Not horrible, but forgettable. And then we move on to The Buddha of Suburbia. And again, much like Pinups, I had no idea that this album was even existed, really, was even in existence. And, for a while I was sort of unsure as to whether it would even count as a studio album, because Bowie has done stuff like this before. He's done soundtracks to a lot of stuff. He's done stuff like he did the soundtrack to he did the soundtrack for Labyrinth and stuff like that, and he did for this I believe play called Ball. I don't know if it was like a movie or a play or something, but he did that. So he's done like a lot of soundtrack albums, and those don't really count as studio albums, so I wasn't sure. But then I looked on David Bowie's website, and it does indeed count as a studio album. So, decided to go ahead and do it. And there's 9 unreleased songs by him. And so I didn't really know what to expect from this, but I ended up liking it. Like, I actually do think it's pretty good. In some ways, it actually does kind of remind me of the Berlin Trilogy, specifically Low and Heroes, because it does have these sort of cool instrumentals. And it really does sound like something you hear on the background music of, what he did. It was the soundtrack to The Buddha of Suburbia, and what that was that it was this mini-series that was broadcast in England, So he did the soundtrack to that. There's a lot of cool songs on here. And for the longest time, the reason that it was probably so obscure because it was deleted from his catalog for whatever reason. And I think Bowie even said that at the time that he recorded it, or at least, reflecting back on it, that it was his favorite album that he had ever done. So it was probably the way of the record company, I guess. So it was out of print for a very long time, and I think it only just now got re-released several years ago, around 2007 or so. But yeah, a lot of the songs on here are pretty good. The Buddha of Suburbia is pretty cool. Sex in the Church is really cool as well. That's probably my favorite song off of here. It's kind of instrumental, but it's also, there's not too many lyrics to it. It's just Bowie repeating Sex in the Church many, many times. But I do like the music. I do like it. And Bleed Like a Crazed Dad is pretty cool as well. Untitled Number 1, cool. So yeah, for the most part, this album is pretty good. If you liked the albums like Low and Heroes, you'll like this one. And so now we move on to Outside. This is from 1995. And this was actually one of the albums that I was looking forward to the most, because this was the one in which he experimented with industrial rock. So I was really looking forward to that, because I'm a big fan of industrial rock. I'm a big fan of industrial metal. And unfortunately, this was kind of disappointing, I must say. It's not a horrible album, again, but at the same time, for what I thought I was going to get and what I got, it was sort of disappointing. But at the same time, it's not a bad album, because it does have its moments, like Hollow Space Boy is really cool. And specifically on the Pet Shop Boys remix of it, it revisits Major Tom. So that's cool in its own right. And the Heart's Filthy Lesson is really cool as well. And it's supposed to be a concept album, once again, much like Diamond Dogs, much like Ziggy Stardust, is a concept album. And originally it was supposed to be a series of concept albums. It was supposed to be an album released every year until the turn of the millennium. Because Bowie wanted to see, where people were in, every year leading up to the millennium. Which is why it's called One Outside. But unfortunately it never ended up coming to pass. Which is a shame, because I actually would, even though this album was a little bit disappointing to me, I really would have liked to, see where these characters kind of go from here. There's a lot of the songs, pretty much every song is from the perspective of a character in the film, like these characters called Leon Blank. And then there's a detective here called Nathan Adler, and, sometimes, there's these sort of like spoken, word things. It's from the point of view of a character. It can be from Nathan Adler or, you know, stuff like that, you know. So for the most part, it is cool, I suppose. If anything, it's a little disappointing because it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. But for the most part, it's a solid album, you know. But it is a lot to take in because it's about 74 minutes. So, you know, it is a lot to take in. You know, it does sort of take a while to kind of grow on you, I guess. So maybe the more times I listen to this album, maybe I'll like it a little bit more. But it does take a while because it is so long. I think it might actually be his longest album, I think. And if it isn't, then it's up there as one of his longest. But yeah, so this one is pretty solid, but admittedly disappointing at the same time. And so we move on to Earthling, which is from 1997. And again, Bowie doing his experimentation. And this album is electronica, drum and bass, and techno. And so I didn't really know what I was going to expect from this. But as it turns out, I really like this album. I really do. And I wasn't expecting to. But I really like this album. I think it has such great songs on here. I think it has a really cool, you know, kind of sound to it. You know, with Bowie and techno, you wouldn't really think that the two would go together, but they really do. You know, the tracks are really cool. Little Wonder, the album opener, it's great. You know, pretty much introduces you to the album, and the whole entire album is really just energetic. You know, just these beats are just really cool. You know, and Looking for Satellites, I really like. 7 Years in Tibet, you know, and you know stuff like 7 Years in Tibet and I'm Afraid of Americans. Those are the kinds of songs that I expected to be on Outside. That's the kind of album I expected Outside to be. You know, those kind of songs. But yeah, I think this is a lot better than what had come before. And just really cool. I really like this one. You know, very energetic, full of energy. You know, you can probably play this at a party and it will just never get old, you know. So I really like this album. So I would definitely recommend this one. You know, especially if you're having like a party or if, you know, it's just a really cool album to kind of listen to if you're really in like an energetic mood or if you're really high energy and stuff like that. If you really like that kind of music, if you really like techno and stuff like that or electronica, you'll like this one fine. Personally, it's probably one of my favorite ones by him and a really underrated one. And so now we move on to Hours, which is 1999. And this one, I actually, again, much like Earthling, I really like this one. This one, you know, it's really cool. And what I like about this album a lot is the fact that it really is just so different from Earthling. And what I mean by that, it's pretty much two different paces. You know, whereas Earthling was, you know, very fast, very high pace, full of energy. This one is a bit more, it's a lot more mellow, you know, and that's even incorporated in the album cover, you know, because the Earthling persona of David Bowie is sort of, he's exhausted, he's just resting, and there's a more youthful Bowie, which is the Hours persona, you know, and that particular persona takes over this album, and it's just really mellow, it's very relaxing. You know, it's a great album to listen to when you get up in the morning, you know, it's very sort of adult. I'm trying to think of the term that's been used. Adult contemporary, that's it. Adult contemporary rock is pretty much what this is. You can probably listen to it on the radio, you know, like those Accu radio stations, like the Magic Sunny Light Mix or whatever it's called. But this one's really cool. You know, you could wake up in the morning, put this album on, you know, fix yourself some coffee, you know, fix yourself some cereal, just, you know, and just relax, which is exactly what I did, you know, this morning, listen to this, you know, because I woke up, I put this album on, you know, fixed myself coffee, poured some cereal, you know, just relaxing in the morning. I just really like this album. One song that really sticks out to me, that I really like, and even something that I didn't really expect, really, is The Pretty Things Are Going to Hell. And this was something that I did not expect, because it is a bit of a far cry from the rest of the album. This is probably the heaviest song. No, this is definitely the heaviest song on the album. It's very fast paced. It's really something that you wouldn't expect on the album, because the rest of the songs are very mellow, very adult contemporary, soft. But this one is pretty fast paced, not necessarily Earthling esque, but kind of like some. It would almost be like some of these, really. It even has a bit of a Cars esque kind of sound to it, sort of new wave in a way. And so I really like that song. I think that's one of the most underrated David Bowie songs. But other than that, I really like this one. I do think it's really cool, underrated as always. I think this one and Earthling are two of his best ones and his most underrated ones. So definitely check this one out, especially if you just kind of want to relax and enjoy yourself, and maybe even like meditate or something like that. This is a great album to put on if you just want to relax. And then we move on to Headon, and unlike the previous two, this one really wasn't that good. I mean, I'm sorry, but this one probably ranks up there as one of my least favorite David Bowie albums. It's up there with Never Let Me Down, and even the first David Bowie album, as just being not very good and sort of underwhelming. I don't know, I think it tries to be like, I think it tries to sort of pick up where, Hours left off, but there's just nothing interesting to it, I don't know, it's just nothing, really sticks out in my mind. It's sort of just been boring, really. Really, the closest to a song that I like on there would be I've Been Waiting For You, which is a Neil Young cover, and it features Dave Grohl on guitar. And you can tell that's him because it has a very Foo Fighters-esque sound to it. But other than that, I just did not care for this album at all. It just wasn't very interesting to me. It was just kind of boring. I know this album got a lot of rave reviews when it came out, but I'm just going to have to disagree with that personally. I just did not think this album was pretty good at all. So, no, I wouldn't recommend it. I'd probably skip it. And so now we move on to Reality, and this came out in 2003. And like I've said before in the past, 2003, one of my favorite years of all time. Just a really cool year for music. And this one, it's a step above Headon. But I don't know if I would say it's great. It does have its moments on here, like New Cure Star is pretty solid. And the cover of Pablo Picasso is pretty cool, and Never Get Old. The Loneliest Guy, which is really cool. It's just really slow, just really melancholy when you really think about it. It's just really cool. I just really like it. And Looking for Water, which is pretty good, and it's also kind of funny considering the character that David Bowie played in The Man Who Fell to Earth, because his character Thomas Jerome Newton, I believe his name is, his character has to leave his planet. He's an alien, and he has to leave his planet because his planet is suffering from a drought. So he goes to Earth looking for water. So I thought this was kind of funny, and I don't even know maybe if Bowie had that in his mind when he was writing that. I don't know if that was in his mind when he was writing that, or if it was just pure coincidence. But I just thought that was kind of a funny moment. And there's a cool George Harrison cover called Try Some, Buy Some. Well, it's not technically... Well, yeah, he did co-write it. Well, George Harrison wrote it, but it was recorded by someone else. But that's a pretty cool cover. And the title track is really good as well. And Bring Me the Disco King, which closes out the album. And that was one that was just like... For a long time, Bowie had it written, but he just never wrote it recorded. It was supposed to be for Black Tie, White Noise, but it ended up never happening. Then I think it was supposed to be in Earthling, but it never ended up happening. And again for Headon, never ended up happening. So finally, he ended up recording it for this one. And I think it really pays off. I think the wait is worth it because it's just a really cool, kind of slow, jazzy kind of song. And it's just a really cool one. This is one of those songs. It's one of the few Bowie songs where the length of the song is actually justified. Because I just think it's really cool. It just moves at its own pace, and I just think it's really cool for that. And so for a long time, Bowie did not release an album, mainly because, like he ended up having a heart attack around the time that he was touring for the album, so he sort of like kind of slowed down, his input material. And a lot of people thought that he retired, and it's not necessarily true, really. But he just kind of kept a low profile for many years. And just kind of kept low for a bit. But then he came out in 2013. He came out in 2013 with this new album, The Next Day. And I was not expecting this album because, while I didn't necessarily think that he was retired, I sort of wondered if he was ever going to put out another album. And then he puts out this song called Where Are We Now? Which was really cool. It was really soothing, sort of in the same vein of Ours, really. And so it was his first album in a decade. And so this was the first Bowie album that I was really looking forward to. And when it came out, I really liked it. But looking back, it's pretty solid. It's not horrible. It's pretty solid. It's pretty good. It's a good comeback album for him. I really like stuff like The Next Day. It's pretty cool. Dirty Boys, which is this kind of retro, jazzy kind of song to it. And I really like that one. The Stars Are Out Tonight is good. Valentine's Day is good. And You Will Set the World on Fire, which is a good little rock song. And just really good. It's just a really good album. A good comeback album for him. So, yeah, it was just really cool. That's all I can say. And then we move on to his latest album, the one that just came out today, Black Star. And much like The Next Day, I was really excited about this album. Especially when the first single came out, Black Star. When I saw it was 10 minutes, I was like, what? But again, much like like the Disco King song off of Reality, Bring Me the Disco King from Reality, I think it's really justified because it really works. And I think it really does move. It moves fast, honestly. It flows really good. For me, it doesn't feel like 10 minutes. It goes by really fast. I think that's the mark of a really good long song, when it can just go by fast in a flash. And, it's just a really good song. And it's the opening track on here. And it really starts off the album very well. It starts out on a path, and it really sets the tone for the album, because this is another one in which Bowie experiments a little bit, because this album is predominantly jazz, which is a bit of an odd kind of move for him, but it actually does work out pretty well. Again, much like Earthling, I think he does take a risk by changing his sound very dramatically, but I think it really works out in this case. I do think it works well. The whole jazz kind of thing really works. Lazarus is pretty cool as well. Sue, or In the Season of Crime, which is probably the heaviest song on the album. And I think the beat of this, it really does remind me of something off the Earthling album. It's just really cool. And I Can't Give Everything Away sort of reminds me of something off the Hours album, combined sort of with Young Americans. And so I think it's a pretty cool album. I think it's definitely a step above his previous few. So I would definitely recommend it. It just came out today, so definitely check it out. It might be a little bit different than what Bowie fans are used to with a jazz sound and all, but I do think that this particular experiment sort of works out very well. So that's all for this David Bowie retrospective. And it was just a really cool retrospective. This was a really cool episode to do. And, listen to all of David Bowie's albums. How he pretty much changed as the years go on. And really no two albums are the same when it comes to him. Because, he's somebody who's always reinventing himself, always changing up his sound. And while not every single album is amazing, I do think the albums that are amazing are really amazing. Stuff like Ziggy Stardust and Aladdin Sane and Diamond Dogs and Earthling and Hours and those are just some of the great albums, So I would definitely recommend David Bowie, at least his 70s stuff, because I think his 70s stuff are just so great, just absolutely amazing. His late 90s stuff are awesome as well, specifically Earthling and Hours. Those are really good as well. The Berlin trilogy, for the most part, is great. His early 70s album, The Man Who Sold the World, and Hunky Dory, those are really good as well. So, yeah, I would definitely recommend Bowie. Just an amazing artist, one of the best ever. So I highly recommend him. He is awesome. So that is all for the Metal Mat Podcast. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you all next time.